Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Chapter 1 of Peter Singer's The Life You Can Save begins with a thought experiment and then launches us directly into what we might say is the real world as opposed to a mere hypothetical, and it's going to confront the results of the thought experiment with our actual practice in the real world that we inhabit, where we make choices, particularly choices about where our money goes in terms of what we spend that money on. And he's going to be suggesting that although in the hypothetical we all acknowledge an ethical obligation to preserve life, when it comes to dealing with poor people in the world in which we inhabit, we don't seem quite so clear about that, and we might in fact be violating some sort of ethical obligation that we do have. So he begins by talking about the thought experiment of a drowning child. On your way to work, you pass a small pond on hot days. Children sometimes play in the pond, which is only about knee deep. The weather's cool today, though, and the hour is early, so you're surprised to see a child splashing around in the pool. As you get closer, you see it's a very young child, just a toddler, who's flailing about. Unable to stay upright or walk out of the pond, you look for the parents or babysitter, but there's no one else around. The child is unable to keep her head above the water for more than a few seconds at a time. If you don't wade in and pull her out, she seems likely to drown. Wading in is easy and safe for you, but you will ruin the new shoes you bought only a few days ago and get your suit wet and muddy. By the time you hand the child over to someone responsible for her and change your clothes, you'll be late for work. What should you do? And Singer says, you look at the situation. There's definitely some costs to saving the child. You're going to ruin your shoes. You're going to be late to work. You're going to have to change your suit, probably take it for a dry cleaning or something like that. But he says, my students don't hesitate. They all say, well, you save the kid. There's no other real ethical alternative. Nobody says, well, how expensive are these shoes, right? Or is being late to work going to create a situation for me? And so he says, I ask my students what they think a person should do, and they all respond, you should save the child. And then I say, well, what about your shoes and being late for work? What about these costs? And they brush them aside. How could anyone consider a pair of shoes or missing an hour or two at work a good reason for not saving a child's life? Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. And in the classroom or in the abstract, it's easy for a person to say, of course I would save the child. What happens in real life? Well, he talks about a situation. Now, we can't extrapolate too much from one particular situation, but at least it demonstrates that not everybody is going to follow that exact line of thinking. He talks about a 2-year-old girl, Wang Yue, in Foshan in southern China. She wanders away from her mother into a small street, and she's hit by a van that doesn't stop. And a CCTV camera captures the incident. And as she lays there bleeding in the street, 18 people walked or rode their bikes right past her without stopping to help. So at least 18 people, maybe they were all, rather unusual types, but Singer is saying maybe not quite so unusual. They didn't stop. They passed on. They didn't concern themselves. Only a street cleaner, so person number 19, actually calls the authorities after she is hit again by a second van that runs over her leg. Now she's rushed to the hospital, but it was too late, and she dies. And he says, if you're like most people, you're probably saying to yourself, I wouldn't have walked past that child. I would have stopped to help. And he says, yeah, maybe you would have. Maybe that you're that kind of person. But consider this. In 2017, statistics that are current at the time he's writing the book, 5.4 million children under 5 years old die of preventable or treatable causes throughout the world. So evidently there were many such cases where a child is dying and it could have been saved, but it's not. And why not? Well, because those children are usually in extreme poverty. And so they're not given the same access to basic goods, even expectations of basic goods, food, water, healthcare, sanitation, shelter, all of these things that could have prevented them from dying or treated what they were dying of. For example, malaria, or measles or diarrhea. He says that some children die because they don't have enough to eat. Some die from these conditions that don't exist in developed nations, or if they do, are almost never fatal. If your kid has terrible diarrhea, you're probably taking them to the doctor and you're putting them on Pedialyte, which you pick up at the drugstore or the grocery store, and they survive, and you've got a little story to tell. In a lot of places, the child is going to die, and the child doesn't have to die. Somebody could have done the equivalent of sacrificing their shoes and a little bit of time to wade in and save that child, or to pay somebody else to do so. So he says, think about your own situation. By donating a relatively small amount of money, you could actually save a child's life. Now, there's some conditions to that, right? It's not a guaranteed sort of thing. It's a probabilistic sort of thing. But donating a small amount of money, you could, keep a child from dying of a preventable or treatable cause. And he says, maybe it might take more than the amount needed to buy a pair of shoes, but we all spend money on things we don't really need, whether on drinks, meals out, clothing, movies, concerts, vacations, new cars, house renovations. And he asks the question, is it possible that by choosing to spend your money on other things rather than contributing to an effective charity, now notice that term, effective charity, not just any charity, but a charity that is putting the money to good use, is it possible that you are leaving a child to die? That you are abandoning an ethical obligation, perhaps to humanity, perhaps to a particular child, perhaps to children in general? Again, the contrast, right? You would have no hesitation to wade into the pond and save the child, or if you were in China, to save little Wang Yu from getting run over a second time and dying as a result, maybe taking her to the hospital. Well, why wouldn't you do that for a child who's going to otherwise die of malaria or dysentery, or pick whatever else, if you have the money that would do it? And he says, there's definitely cost to this, but if you wanted to, you could afford those costs, couldn't you? It's certainly possible for you to do that because you're not living in extreme poverty. Even if you're living in poverty in a developed nation, you do have some resources that other people typically don't. Now, he does address an issue, and he says, I'm going to talk about this more later on in the book, but somebody might say, well, I don't know, so this is the effective charity, I don't know that by giving I'm actually going to do anything that changes the overall problem. He says, many people don't give to charities that seek to reduce extreme poverty. Why? Because they believe it's a hopeless task and we're making no progress. And as it turns out, when we look at the facts, well, it looks like charities, not only charities, but other organizations, including governments, have indeed made a lot of progress when it comes to extreme poverty. So it's not a problem without a solution. And certainly at the level of a single child, it's not a problem without a solution. Even if you can't keep all children from dying of malaria, you could certainly keep a child from dying of malaria, right? And so then he goes on and he talks about, consider examples of what we actually spend our money on and whether we could find the money if we wanted to in our usual spending. He says, you don't have to look at the super rich spending money on luxuries like, giant yachts or private planes or even their fancy wristwatch that you could sell and save dozens of people. He says, think about some of the ways Americans with average income spend their money. In most places in the United States, you can get your recommended 8 glasses of water a day out of the tap for less than a penny. But is that what a lot of people do? Well, a lot of people opt for store-bought, where a typical bottle of water costs about $1.50, and some brands like Fiji, imported all the way from the Fiji Islands, will set you back even more. These are, costs that are a little bit, we might say, in arrears because the book was published a few years ago. And he goes on and he says, Americans are buying more and more bottled water. Think about caffeine. You can make coffee at home for pennies rather than spending $4 or more on a latte, probably $6 or more at this point. And that $6, if you're doing it daily, could easily be saving a child, right? Or have you ever casually said yes to a waiter's prompt to order a second soda or glass of wine you didn't even finish? He talks about food waste, and that a lot of household garbage is perfectly good food in its original packaging, not out of date. People just throw it out. Americans waste, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, 30 to 40% of their food supply. People also buy an astonishing amount of clothing they never wear. He gives some examples. 200 pounds worth on average per person in the United Kingdom, according to one survey. In the United States, fashion designer Deborah Lindquist claims the average woman owns more than $600 worth of clothing she's not worn in the last year. And Singer says, hey, I don't know whether these figures are accurate, but whatever the figures are, it's fair to say almost all of us, men and women alike, buy things we don't need, some of which we never use. So, it's clear that even if we're not rich, we do have ways we could find the money in our usual spending if we indeed wanted to do something about children living in extreme poverty through effective charities. And so he's going to bring this to a close with it's an argument that's being made here, but it's framed as a question, and it's very suggestive. Most of us are absolutely certain we wouldn't hesitate to save a drowning child, and we would do it at considerable cost to ourselves. Yet, while thousands of children die each day, we spend money on things we take for granted and would hardly notice if they were not there. Is that wrong? Is that violating an ethical obligation towards the poor? If so, he asks, how far does our obligation to the poor go? And this is essentially a utilitarian argument. He's, framing all of this in terms of outcomes, in terms of decisions that we make, in which, if we were to divert resources, we probably would not reduce our level of happiness very much, but we could boost happiness or alleviate misery on the part of other people quite effectively by just diverting those resources, which we have the capacity to do in the present. So this is a very powerful argument that he's making, and he's confronting us with the difference between these sorts of cases, a hypothetical thought experiment and the real life, real world situation of those who are vulnerable and poor when other people could be saving them from death. That would be, alleviating preventable or treatable causes that otherwise, would kill these children. And now notice too, as I close this, Singer is framing this primarily in terms of children. He knows very well that this is going to make the case a little bit stronger for us. Why children? Well, because we can say that they're more vulnerable, they have less agency, and we feel perhaps a greater sense of obligation to them than we would for 40-year-old adults. But the same logic could indeed apply to 18-year-olds, to 70-year-olds, to people all different ages in between.